So we have reached the last stage of Criminal Law Book 1, and this is the topic on penalties. You have to remember that, diba, in criminal law, it defines the crimes, treats of their kind, and provides for their penalties. So there's a need for you to discuss regarding penalties with respect to your Criminal Law Book 1. I've already given you the table of penalties. All you have to do is familiarize it so that you may be guided as to how do you apply that table with the penalties. Now, there are certain juridical conditions with respect to penalty. According to one author, the penalty must be productive of suffering without affecting the integrity of the human personality. So, according to the classical theory, ang penalty daw, it has to provide suffering on the part of the accused who committed the crime, but without affecting the integrity of his human personality. Pero sir, di ba maka-affect mo gyapon og unsa integrity ng makulong ka? Of course not. What the classical theory is trying to tell us is that penalties must not be excessive or must be not be unusual. Ano lang ilang pasabot ka nang dili ka incarcerate naked kana ano yung pasabot. It should be it should produce suffering, but at the same time it should maintain your integrity as a human being. Second, it must be commensurate to the offense. So for example, if you committed the crime of murder, then the higher penalty should be meted out to you. Whereas if you committed a light felony, then it should also be a light penalty that should be given to you. Lain pod no kung nangawat kag ballpen unya ang penalty nimo kay reclusion perpetua, di ba? It's unfair. So it should be commensurate to the offense. Third, it must be personal, meaning you cannot if you committed the crime, then ikaw dapat ang managot sa crime na yan. It should not be others. Like for example, if you committed the crime of direct assault, your mother cannot take in for you. So for you as the one who should be meted out with the penalty. Alam ka namang igno nimo, pwede dili ako ang unsa mo service sa sentence na ako, pwede akong inahan na lang. No, it's not. Because it should be, the penalty should be personal. Sa imuhan na. It must be legal and also must be certain and equal for all. And lastly, it should be correctional. Meaning, when you say correctional, the end goal of penalty should be for you to reform your ways. Meaning, wag mo nang gagawin because this penalty should help you correct your ways and means. Now, the purpose of the state in punishing crimes are the following. It is to secure justice. The state has an existence of its own to maintain, a conscience for its own to assert, and moral principles to be vindicated. So penal justice must therefore be exercised by the state in the service and satisfaction of a duty and rests primarily on the moral rightfulness of the punishment inflicted. So for us prosecutors, the reason why we prosecute the accused in this case is in order for us to secure justice, to give justice to the complainants and the victims. Now, there are certain theories as to how penalty should be justified. Ganong namang give penalty? How do we justify penalty? So the first one is prevention. The state must punish the criminal to prevent or suppress the danger to the state arising from the criminal acts of the offender. Diba? So, if in order for us, the common good, in order for us not to commit crimes, nagidapay penalty kay para dili ta magpataka-taka o commit og any crimes. This is a deterrent, kumbaga. It deters you from committing crimes. So as para ma-prevent nimo ang commission of the crime. Second, self-defense. The state has the right to punish the criminal as a measure of self-defense so as to protect society from threat and the wrong inflicted by the criminal. Third is reformation. So the object of punishment in criminal cases is to correct and reform the offender. The reason of this is in order to give the accused a chance to redeem himself. Okay, just because you have committed a crime does not mean you are not capable of reforming. Lastly, this is justice. The crime must be punished by the state as a retributive justice, a vindication of the absolute right and moral law violated by the criminal. Justice, this is to vindicate your right, meaning vengeance. The state will do this for you out of vengeance for you. Now, the penalties under the revised penal code have a threefold purpose. The first one is retribution or expiation, meaning the penalty is commensurate with the gravity of the offense. When you say retribution, this is out of kung si Cardo pa, justisya, justice, vengeance for the state, for those criminals who have committed the wrong. Second, correction or reformation. Again, this is to provide means in order for the accused to change his ways and to reform, to be reinstated back into the society. And lastly, as a social defense, because it has shown its severity to recidivists and habitual delinquents. As you can remember, di ba, pag lagi recidivist or habitual delinquents, mao ni sila mga individual na sige pirmi o commit o crime. So, if you are if you allow yourself to commit crimes most of the time, then all the more the revised penal code will be more stricter on your case. Slightly. Okay, Mr. Reynes, noted. Now, my question with respect to theories involving the penalty. Naibawata na? No?
No, sir.
So again, this is the table showing the duration of the penalties. So when you say reclusion temporal, it's the entire duration of your reclusion temporal is from 12 years and 1 day to 20 years. With respect to your prison mayor, it's 6 years and 1 day to 12 years. Prison correctional, 6 months and 1 day to 6 years. Arresto mayor, 1 month and 1 day to 6 months. And arresto menor, 1 to 30 days. Now, each penalty may be subdivided into 3 periods. You have your minimum, medium, and maximum. Now, again, let's have a simple activity. Identify the period of penalty. For example, if you committed the crime of unlawful arrest, then your penalty will be arresto mayor. So what is the duration of arresto mayor? Pangitaan ninyo. Ikaw will unlawfully arrest an individual, you will have a penalty of arresto mayor. So unsa man ang duration sa imong penalty if found guilty?
1 month and 1 day to 6 months, sir.
Okay, very good, Miss. Sa to?
Pericano, sir.
Miss Paricano. Okay, thank you, Miss Paricano. About falsification by a private individual using falsified documents. So if you are a private individual who falsified certain documents, you will be treated out with the penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods. So, ikaw nag-falsify, you are a private individual, and gigamit mo ng falsified documents. Sa diha ang prison correctional medium maximum. So what is the duration of prison correctional medium to maximum?
Four years to 2 months, sir.
Ha?
From 2 years and 4 months and 1 day to 4 years and 2 months to 4 years 2 months and 1 day to 6 years.
Okay, very good, Miss Paricano. Actually, it's 2 years, 4 months, and 1 day to 6 years. Okay, medium to maximum naman, di ba? Ang medium, ang pinaka-minimum niya is 2 years, 4 months, and 1 day. So if you say medium and maximum, ang minimum period niya would be 2 years, 4 months, and 1 day up to 6 years. But it's still correct, Miss Paricano, in essence. Thank you, Miss Paricano. Now, okay, what about robbery in an inhabited house or public building? You will be punished by the crime of reclusion temporal. Robbery in an inhabited place, and you property with a value exceeding 50,000 pesos. So, the punishment, if found guilty, will be reclusion temporal. Now, unsay duration sa imuhang reclusion temporal?
From 12 years and 1 day to 20 years, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Clamor.
Thank you, sir.
Right. How about maltreatment of prisoners? If you become a police officer and you maltreated your prisoner, you were found guilty, the penalty would be prison correctional in its medium period, prison mayor in its minimum period. Okay, klaro ha? Prison correct easy, medium to prison mayor, minimum. Kasi commit mo na crime. What will be your duration if you committed the crime of maltreatment of prisoners? Prison correctional, medium to prison mayor, minimum.
From 2 years, 4 months, and 1 day to 8 years, sir.
Very good, Mr. Clamor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Klaro ha? Ingana ang unta. At least you have a guide. Kung let's say, giingnan mo na mo nag-prepare mo investigative report, and that kaning investigative report ninyo is, let's say, homicide. Unya, makita ninyo sa revised penal code na ang homicide DI is, let's say, ingani ang penalty. So at least kabalo na mo unsa ang iyahang penalty, unsang range, and you will also know if it is afflictive, if it is correctional, or a light penalty. Now, penalties that may be imposed. No felony shall be punishable by any penalty not prescribed by law prior to its commission. So your Article 21 speaks of nullum crimen nullum pena sine liga again, which states that which states that there is no crime but there is no law that punishes it. So it guarantees that no act of a citizen will be considered criminal unless the state has made it so by law and has provided a penalty. Ang naman, imprison ka nila, unya wala penalty, di ba? Now, Article 22 speaks of retroactive effect of penal laws. As a rule, penal laws should have a retroactive effect insofar as they favor the persons guilty of a felony who is not a habitual criminal, as this term is defined in Rule 5 of Article 62 of this code. Although at the time of the publication of such laws, a final sentence has been pronounced and the convict is serving the same. Diba, one of the characteristics of your criminal laws, diba, prospective siya. The exception to that prospective characteristic, if it's this one, penal laws will be allowed a retroactive effect if it is favorable to the accused and he is not a habitual criminal. So may example, ana. For example, very common karon. You committed the crime of selling drugs, let's say marijuana, and that you were not given, let's say lang 12 years and 1 day to 20 years ang penalty. But here comes a new law which allows you to plea bargain and at the same time reduce your penalty to, let's say, 6 years. So what will happen, di ba? The new law is favorable to the accused. So pwede ang accused ron mo apply sa under the new law because although this law is just new and this law is not the prevailing law at the time the crime was committed, it will be given retroactive effect to them because it is favorable to them. So hence, pwede sila mag-ask og application sa bagong balaod kay it is favorable to them. But they also have to comply with the requirement that they should not be a habitual criminal. Please remember that ex post facto clause are clauses or provisions which prohibit Congress from giving retroactivity to criminal laws, which is unfavorable to the accused. Bug lagi, sir. Okay, ingani. Retroactive laws of retroactive effect of penal laws may be given retroactive effect if it is favorable to the accused and if he is not a habitual criminal. Now, ang ex post facto law, dili siya pwede come into law if it is unfavorable to the accused. So there is a difference to that. All right, moving on. How do I minimize this? Yun. Article 23. Effect of pardon by the offended party. A pardon of the offended party does not extinguish criminal action except as provided in Article 344 of this code. But civil liability with regard to the interest of the injured party is extinguished by his express waiver. So when you speak of Article 23, muna sila mga complainants na sila yung mga victims or complainants na buhatan ni mo criminal act. So when they pardon you, it is an act of forgiveness. So it means it is a private pardon because they are the complainants, they are the victims. Now, if they forgive you, the criminal action will still remain because the criminal action is a crime committed against the state. Kaya nga, di ba, people of the Philippines versus Mr. Clamor, for example. So, mao na reason na if an offended party forgives you, dili kay na automatic ma-dismiss imong kaso. It will still remain. Kung i-forgive man kasi muhang complainant, it is because he is willing to settle the civil aspect or civil liability that comes along with your criminal action. So, kaning executive pardon, this is the one given by the president. Whereas, kaning private pardon, mo nang ginahatag sa mga offended party, kaya mga common tao na parehas na to. Now, also a difference. Executive pardon, the president, in the exercise of his pardoning power, under the Constitution, may grant executive clemency to a person convicted of a crime. However, while the executive pardon extinguishes the criminal liability of the offender, it will not relieve the offender of his civil liability to the private complainant. In short, pag magpardon ng president, mawala ang criminal liability sa criminal, but ma-remain ang civil liability lang nila. Whereas, in private pardon, offended party as complainant of the civil aspect of the criminal case may expressly waive his interest in the civil liability of the accused. However, such pardon does not extinguish the criminal aspect of the case. Baliktad. Pag i-pardon ka sa imuhang complainant or sa imuhang victim, ang mawala lang kay ang civil liability or ang ma-reduce lang ang civil liability but mag-remain ang criminal aspect tungod kay the criminal aspect is an act against the state and not against the offended party. Klaro or naipangutana? Pangutana?
Wala, sir.
Wala. Alright, sige. What is the concept of preventive imprisonment? So let's say a warrant of arrest was issued against Mr. Cabrera for the crime of, let's say, acts of lasciviousness. Now, when he was caught, he was committed to a detention facility. Kaning pag-detain sa iya dito sa detention facility, is it already a penalty or is it a preventive imprisonment? What do you think?
Preventive imprisonment.
Yes, it is a
Ano sa to, sir?
preventive. It is a, the question here is, if let's say si Mr. Cabrera na warrant of arrest for acts of lasciviousness and then gidakop siya and he was detained in a detention facility, aning pagkulong sa iyaha sa detention facility, is it already a penalty or is it just a preventive imprisonment?
Preventive imprisonment.
Okay, very good, Mr. Cabrera. Now, preventive imprisonment only why? The accused who is undergoing prevention detention is called a detention prisoner. Preventive imprisonment is not a penalty. Arrest and temporary detention of a suspect is not a penalty. The purpose of such imprisonment is not to punish, but to prevent the detainee from not facing the accusation against him. In short, the reason why there is a preventive imprisonment is so that you will face the charges against you. Dili ka mag-escape ko. Kay para ikaw mo atubang dito dito sa husgado o sa iyang piskal o iyang sa imuhang complainant. One of the reason of preventive, natay ginatawag na preventive imprisonment. Now, you have here your Article 25, which speaks of penalties which may be imposed. So here are the following penalties which may be imposed. We have two types. First, the principal penalties. Aning principal penalties mo ni ginabutang sa imong judgment. For example, he's meted out to the penalty of capital punishment, reclusion perpetual, temporal, prison correctional, arresto mayor, arresto menor, or what? Mo na ginabutang sa judge. So it is differentiate according to afflictive penalties, correctional penalties, or light penalties. Another type of penalty is what you call accessory penalties. So these are the following: perpetual or temporarily absolute, special disqualification, suspension from public office, civil interdiction, indemnification, forfeiture or confiscation of instruments, and payment of costs. We'll discuss about this later on para ma-appreciate the accessory penalties. Now, a principal penalty is the penalty imposed by the court expressly in the judgment of conviction, whereas an accessory penalty is a penalty which is deemed imposed in the principal if not mentioned in the decision. Another definition is accessory penalty is a penalty which is deemed included in the imposition of the principal penalties. In short, pag nakay principal penalty, ano yung accessory penalty is nakalakip or deemed already within that principal penalty. Now, as amended by Republic Act 10951, it has already amended what grave, less grave, or light felonies are. So grave felonies are those to which the law attaches the capital punishment or penalties which are in their periods are afflictive. So muna ang mga grave felonies. So if you go back, grave felonies are those which are in their afflictive penalties or kaning capital. So capital, reclusion perpetual, reclusion temporal, and your prison mayor. Whereas less grave felonies are those which the law punishes with penalties which in their maximum period are correctional in nature. So sa may correctional in nature diri. So correctional penalties, meaning these are less grave felonies na imong prison correctional and arresto mayor. And lastly, light felonies are those which involve light penalties such as your arresto mayor. Or if the fine is not exceeding 40,000 pesos. So what if, sir, ang dili imprisonment ang penalty? What if fine? How do we know if it is afflictive, correctional, or light penalty? Now, this is answered by Article 26 as amended by Republic Act 10951. A fine, whether imposed as a single or as an alternative penalty, shall be considered afflictive penalty if it exceeds 1,200,000. In short, if it is 1,200,001 pesos and above, it is afflictive in nature if kana imuhang fine. Now, kung correctional penalty, kung saan yung pagkabalo, if ang fine correctional penalty lang siya, if it is 1.2 million pesos but it's not less than 40,000 pesos. In short, if mag-range siya from 40,000 to 1.2 million, mao na ang correctional penalty nimo if fine ra. And lastly, makaibalo ka na ang fine nimo is light lang if below 40,000 pesos. Meaning, if it is 39,000 pesos 999 and below, makaingon yung ka na, light penalty lang ang gihatag sa kuha. Klaro?
Okay, sir.
Alright. Pardon. So let's say, what if I pardon? So sa effect niya, a pardon shall not work the restoration of the right to hold public office or the right of suffrage unless such rights be expressly restored by the terms of the pardon. A pardon shall in no case exempt the culprit from the payment of the civil indemnity imposed upon him by the sentence. Now, Article 36 speaks of presidential pardon. Now, pag mag-pardon gani ang president, sure. Excuse me. Bail bond ng estafa. 130,000. Article 319. Sige. Hello, sorry. So there was an emergency here in the office kay no para sila kung saang pag-compute sa bail ban. Anyway, let's move on. So Article 36 speaks of pardon by the president. So when a president pardons you, dili kay automatic na, di ba, mawala ma-extinguish imong criminal liability. But dili kay automatic na ma-restore imong right to public office or ma-restore imong right to vote. Dapat sa pardon na letter mismo or sa pardon na kasulatan, dapat nakabutang yun diha expressly or nakasulat yun diha sa provisions na upon this pardon by the president, your right to public office will be restored or your right to vote shall also be restored. Dapat nakabutang na. If walay nakabutang diha, it does not mean na makabalik na ka to hold office or maka-vote na ka. Also, the pardon of the president will not exempt you from civil indemnity. So, if he pardons you for your criminal action, dapat katong danyos nimo na kailangan nimo ibayad sa imuhang complainant will still remain and you still have to pay that to your complainant or victim. That is the effect of Article 36 or pardon by the president. Okay, let's move on to Section 3, penalties in which other accessory penalties are inherent. So, wala akong ginaingon. If you are meted out with the penalty of death, nasa accessory penalties such as perpetual disqualification, absolute disqualification, civil interdiction for 30 years, kung reclusion perpetua o reclusion temporal imong ipataw sa imuha kay tungod nakapatay ka, kani ang imuhang accessory penalties. Civil interdiction for life during the period of the sentence, perpetual absolute disqualification also. So, what if si Mr. Bercero, si Macopalayo, committed the crime of murder and he was sentenced to, let's say, reclusion temporal or perpetua. So, ang accessory penalty na nakalakip dito sa reclusion perpetua temporal are civil interdiction and perpetual absolute disqualification. So, what does this mean? In short, Mr. Bercero is deprived of the public offices and employments which the offender may have held even if conferred by popular election. Let's say, Vice Mayor si Mr. Bercero, and he was found out to have committed the crime of murder and he was guilty. Tungod kay naay perpetual or temporary absolute disqualification, kaning reclusion perpetua temporal, he will be deprived of such office. Also, he will be deprived of the right to vote and be voted upon or be elected to a position. Disqualification for the offices, for public employments, for exercise of any rights. So, let's say, si Mr. Bercero, si Macopalayo, a retired policeman, but he committed the crime of murder, and since naay kaning murder, reclusion perpetua or temporal, naay accessory penalty na perpetual or temporarily absolute disqualification, mawala iyang rights to retirement pay or any other pension or any office formerly held. So, diba, sayang kayo? Apart from temporary absolute disqualification ay civil interdiction, diba? Kung sa maning civil interdiction shall deprive the offender, or in this case, it will deprive Mr. Bercero during the time of his sentence of the rights of parental authority, meaning wala siya authority mahimong amahan sa iyang mga anak, maging guardian as to the person or property of his ward. Wala siya karapatan in terms of responsibilities to his spouse. Wala po siya karapatan na mag-manage sa iyang property o mag-dispose sa iyang propriedad by any act or conveyance inter vivos. So naklaro ang example kung let's say an individual has been meted out with a certain penalty and what are its accessory penalties? Hello?
Yes, yes, sir.
Klaro ha? Alright. So for example, si Mr. Bersero, di ba nakabutang dire, he is not allowed to manage his property and the right to dispose of such property. So let's say naghimo si Mr. Bersero og last will and testament. Niingon siya. Kay tungod for a lifetime naman gyud ko diri sa prisuhan, ako nang panghatag ang ako ang mga propriedad sa akong mga anak, sa akong mga igsuon, o sa ako ang let's say sa akong maguwang, sa ako ang ginikanan. Is that allowed?
No, sir.
Why?
No, sir.
Because according to Article 34 of the Civil Introduction, so he has no right to manage property and the right to dispose of such property
Very good, Mr.
by
Sumambot.
any act or any
Very good,
convenience.
Mr. Sumambot. So, dili siya allowed mag-dispose sa iyang property inter vivos. When you say inter vivos, during his lifetime. So, what if ingani ang tenor sa iyang last will and testament? Kay sunod, kay tungod, dili naman gyud ko mamatay, I will give the following properties to my children and to my brothers and sisters and to my parents, and will take effect, and this last will and testament will take effect after my death. Now, is that allowed? What do you think? What if ang last will and testament nimo kay to take effect lang after namatay na ka or mortis causa and not during inter vivos or during your lifetime?
Pwede na siguro, sir, kay wala naman tong kuan. Tapos naman ang sentence niya, kay patay naman po siya.
Okay, very good, Mr. Bersero. Because your civil interdiction will only operate during your lifetime. Grabe po no kung patay na kang operate gyapon imong civil interdiction, right? Kaya nakabutang po specifically under Article 34 that you are deprived of your rights during your lifetime. That is inter vivos and not when ka patay na ka. So, if maghimo ko, let's say, for example, you have civil interdiction as your penalty. In short, ayaw paghimo og last will and testament na inter vivos. Ang himo nimo kanang mortis causa, kanang pasabot ana kanang imong last will and testament mo take effect after namatay na ka. Murag naghimo lang kag record ba ihatag nimo ni kani kana unya mo take effect siya after namatay na ka. Klaro?
Yes, sir.
All right. So that is how you apply provisions 40 to 45 with respect to your principal and accessory penalties. All right. Okay. Question. The court said you are hereby sentenced to 20 years of reclusion temporal. Wala siya giingon. During the 20 years, am I entitled to vote? Am I entitled to hold office? Can I exercise parental authority over my children? So the answer there is you cannot, di ba? Because reclusion temporal has its temporary, absolute, and specific disqualifications. Why? Because if you are sentenced to 20 years of reclusion temporal, you will also suffer from suspension, disqualification, and civil interdiction. Hence, you cannot say the court never said that. The court should have said you are hereby sentenced to 20 years of reclusion temporal plus civil interdiction. Sa court, manggod class, di naman good moingon ng kung let's say magpataw ng judgment, i-read lang yun ng wherefore, premises considered, the accused is hereby found guilty of the crime of blah 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 is meted out with the penalty of reclusion temporal. Iingon ang duration. Kana lang yun. Dili na nila ingon tong accessory penalty na will also suffer civil interdiction, will also suffer disqualification. Dili na nila ingon. Because it is already deemed as implied in the reclusion temporal. So mo na ang reason ano dili na nila gina expressly ingon. Okay, chapter 5, execution and service of penalties. When and how a penalty is to be executed. Please remember that no penalty shall be executed except by virtue of a final judgment. So this is an example of your sample judgment. Wherefore, in the light of the above discussions and findings, judgment is hereby rendered finding the accused, alias Toy Toy, guilty of the crime of direct assault, defined under Article 148 of the Revised Penal Code, as amended. Accordingly, he is hereby sentenced to an indeterminate term of imprisonment ranging from 4 months and 1 day of arresto mayor maximum as minimum, 3 years, 6 months and 1 day, and 21 days of prison correctional medium as his maximum. He is also ordered to pay a fine of 10,000 pesos with subsidiary imprisonment in case of insolvency. When you say subsidiary imprisonment, if he cannot pay for the fine of 10,000 pesos, then this 10,000 pesos will be converted to jail time. Okay, moving on. Ay, anyway, na may pangutana.
Sir, katong sa kung gani sir, katong sa mga kung sir kung ayan na lang sir. Murag dili man connect. Kanang di ba katong si Laila Dilima sir? Di ba nang kulong siya sir?
Okay.
Di ba? Nga naman to sir, murag di ba na murag nganong nakadagan man siya senator ba to sir?
Question, has she been meted out with a judgment or wala?
Murag wala na ko siya murag
Diba,
kabalan ako.
Wala pa man siya napatawan ng judgment. So that means wala pa siya principal penalty na meted out sa kanya. Actually, the trial is just ongoing.
Ay.
O, di ba? So wala pa siya disqualification.
Mo lang to sir, klaro na pa murag wala pud ko ka.
Okay lang. For at least karon nasabtan na ninyo ano nakadagan sila, di ba?
Sir, question, sir. Kung ano ka sir, related ka dito sa kay Laila Dilima. What if sir ni daog siya tapos di ba ongoing pa man ang ano tapos na kanang found out nga kanang guilty siya tapos kana tas ni daog na siya. Kasi mahitabuan na sir, matanggal siya sa kuan.
It will depend on the principal penalty. For example, if ang principal penalty is, let's say, reclusion temporal or perpetua, then definitely she will be disqualified from office. Banggal siya from office. But if it is just prison correctional, ang penalty sa crime na ang judgment na gihatag sa iyaha, then it is just mere suspension from office.
Ay, okay, sir.
Okay. So always ka magtanaw kung unsa ang penalty nila. So kung unsa ang penalty nila sa crime nila yung gibuhat, hindi mo tanawon accessory penalty. Are they still allowed to go into office? Are they disqualified? Do they still have the right to vote? O na siya. So always go back to your principal and accessory penalties. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to complex crimes. May pangutana? Pangutana na. Sige. Wala? Sige. Gusto man yung complex crime. So, concept sa complex crime. So, there is a complex crime when a single act constitutes 2 or more grave or less grave felonies or when the offense is a necessary means of committing the other. Libuga, sir, oy. Anyway, let's put that into sample, okay, para ma-appreciate nyo sa complex crime. So there are two types of complex crimes. The first one is your compound crime or delito compuesto. So when a single act constitutes two or more grave or less grave felonies, they are called as such. Whereas it is a complex crime proper or a delito complejo if an offense is committed as a necessary means to commit the other. Sige, let's go down to compound crime or delito compuesto. This is the single act that constitutes two or more grave or less grave felonies. So let's say si Makupayo, si Miss Pelicano, nilabay siyang hand grenade to the ground, and in so doing, unstable ang internet. And in so doing, let me just turn off my other cell phone hacket. Kuya, kayo musuyot o net ng iPhone. So anyway, let's say si Miss Pelicano, nilabay og hand grenade. Tapos paglabay ng hand grenade, nakapatay siya 10 katao. And naapoy 5 na halos sapit na nga matay kay bystanders man. So ang pasabot ba ni, does this mean that there are 10 crimes of murder and there are 5 crimes of frustrated murder na i-commit ni Miss Pelicano? Of course not. There is only one complex crime of multiple murder with multiple frustrated murder because there is only one act of throwing the hand grenade. Although as a result of that act, several grave or less grave felonies resulted. Claro?
Yes.
Okay. So, labay kag bomba, nya dagan kinangamatay, nya dagan po ang nahapit na matay. So that single act is already that is only a single act of one complex crime of multiple murder with multiple frustrated murder. Dili kay nakakommit ko 10 murders ug 5 ka frustrated murders, dili siya ingana. Because my one act committed all of these multiple felonies. Yung sa maning complex crime proper or delito complejo or katong when an offense is committed as a necessary means in order to commit the other. So there are 2 acts. It is not a single act. You commit the felonies one after the other. So ang first felony mo is not the ultimate object, but it's only the stepping stone para makakommit ka og another offense. So you commit this not because that is your intention. It's only the first step to commit another. So one is the means to commit the other felony. Example is estafa through falsification of documents. So, ganong unsa man ni siya, ganong considered man siya as delito complejo because will falsify the check by counterfeit the signature of the lawyer so that I could encash the check. So the falsification was the crime committed as a necessary means in order to defraud the bank or in order to commit estafa. Possible abduction with rape. So, offender with lewd designs abducted a woman and drove her somewhere, and through force and intimidation had carnal knowledge with her. The forcible abduction was the first step in order to commit the second felony, which is the rape. The Supreme Court said here that the crime is forcible abduction with rape. Muna siya gitawag na complex crime or sex crime proper or delito complejo.
Sir, ang serial killing, sir, ay kanang mga serial killer, sir. Ang mga crime ana nila, sir, mga complex crime ba na, sir?
Hindi siya ma-considered as complex crime because when you say serial killer, their intention is just to kill, di ba? Kill one girl after another. So it is not a step or means to get to the other. So it is not a delito completo. Dili mo
Sa
siya
kanya na lang
mo,
kita kay wala pa man.
hindi mo siya mo consider as the other one because your single act did not use several acts. So it is one intent for one action and then one intent for another action. So you will have multiple counts of, let's say, murder.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So let's move on to the concept of destierro. So destierro is any person sentenced to destierro shall not be permitted to enter the place or places designated in the sentence, nor within the radius therein specified. It shall not be more than 250 and not less than 25 kilometers from the place designated. So literally, ang destierro is a punishment. So the court will tell you that you are not allowed on a particular place within a particular period. So kanang place na a certain radius na you are not allowed to enter or be in that area. The court will specify that you are not allowed to enter the radius of more than 250 kilometers or the minimum not less than 25 kilometers. Ngano? So may rationale aning destierro. Actually, common din siya na punishment sa mga concubine or sa mga mistresses for parties convicted of concubinage. Katong mga kabit, katong concubine or mistress is meted out with the penalty of destierro. Ano man, ano hindi sila ipaduol dito sa area kay ngano? Kay dumugon na sila sa ilahang sa family members sa lalaki or sa wife sa babae, sa lalaki. Mao na destierro. Palayo girl, layo sa girl, palayo sa girl kay dumugon ka diri sa pamilya sa lalaki kay ikaw kabit ka sa husband. Mao nang reason ngano na ay destierro. Klaro? Pangutana?
Wala, sir.
Okay. So, Miss Pedroso, if you're found out to be a concubine or a mistress, palayoon yun ka kay dumugon ka sa membro sa pamilya sa lalaki or sa legal wife sa lalaki. So, muna, please remember that. Munang itawag na destierro. Okay. Title 4, Extinction of Criminal Liability. Saon wala sa criminal liability nimo? There it is answered by Article 89 of the Revised Penal Code. So how is criminal liability totally extinguished? So it is extinguished by the following. First, by the death of the convict. As to the personal penalties and as to pecuniary penalties, liability therefore is extinguished only when the death of the offender occurs before final judgment. So for example, si Miss Tersumambot is under trial for the crime of homicide. During trial, nisakit iyang dughan and nakuyapan siya. Little did we know that he suffered from a heart attack sa Bacopalayo. Is the death of Mr. Sumambot, does the death of Mr. Sumambot extinguish his criminal liability as to the crime of homicide?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Ipatay naman.
Kay wala naman, sir. Kay na-address sa number 1, sir. Nakasulat, by the death of the convict as the personal penalties and as to pecuniary penalties liability therefore is extinguished only when the death of the offender occurs before final judgment. And namatay naman sa mambot, sir. So wala na siya ikuan.
So when,
Natanggal na ang
at what stage of the proceedings did he die?
criminal
During?
liability.
During trial. Trial stage pa, di ba? So, kaning trial stage man good, in trial stage man good, wala pa may final
Sir.
judgment, ana, di ba? So, correct, Mr. You are correct, Mr. Cabrera. However, if final judgment has already been rendered convicting you of the crime, tapos di pa ka namatay, then your criminal liability will not be extinguished. You have to remember that death of the convict should be before final judgment. So second is by service of the sentence. Kanang i-serve mo yung sentence mo dito ka sa tapikol. Third, by amnesty, which completely extinguishes the penalty and all its effects. Amnesty is given by the legislative. Yeah. Fourth, by absolute pardon. That is given by the president. Fifth, by prescription of the crime. When you say prescription of the crime, there are certain crimes, Manggo, that should be filed within a certain period. For example, like felonies. Let's say slight physical injuries. Let's say si Mr. Sumambot, isumbag niya si Mr. Bersero sa noun. And so Mr. Bersero suffered slight physical injuries kay nihubag iyang noun. So let's say that happened on May 25, 2022. So under the law, Mr. Bersero, has 2 months to file a case of slight physical injuries against Mr. Sumambot, or else his right to file an action would have prescribed. Yes, Dinyo, you have to file within a certain amount of time para ma-vindicate ang inyong right. Sixth, by prescription of penalty. Let's say, convicted na mo, gihatag ng penalty. Yeah, for some reason, for some glorious moment, let's say si Mr. Cabrera, nasa dito sa tapikol, let's say naka-escape siya. And then pag escape niya, kasi 20 years siya naka-evade sa iyang sentensya. And let's say ang penalty is just 6 years. So, tungkol sa length of time na wala niya na-serve ang iyang penalty, then it is as if na-extinguish na iyang criminal liability. And lastly, by the marriage of the offended woman as provided for in Article 344 of this. So that is how you extinguish your criminal liability. But first, let us distinguish amnesty from pardon. Amnesty covers a group of people. Pardon, individual lang. Amnesty covers political crimes only. Whereas pardon may be granted for common crimes. Amnesty erases the crime. Pardon erases the penalty, but not the crime. The conviction still remains. Amnesty can come before conviction, meaning during or after conviction, it can be given anytime. But pardon comes only after conviction. Amnesty is an official act by the executive department. Confers it, and there is no need to present evidence of the amnesty proclamation. But pardon is a private act by the president, not within the realm of judicial notice. Hence, in order to invoke pardon, one must present evidence that he has been really pardoned by the president. Muna ko gingon kaniha prescription of crime. Crimes punishable by death, reclusion perpetua, or reclusion temporal shall prescribe in 20 years. So let's say, for example, Simba ko palayo, si Miss Paricano, gi-rape karon March 26, 2022. So she has 20 years to file a case against the accused because rape is punishable by reclusion perpetua or temporal. Then you have there the rest, crimes punishable by other afflictive penalties shall prescribe in 15 years. Those punishable by a correctional penalty shall prescribe in 10 years, with the exception of those punishable by arresto mayor, which shall prescribe in 5 years. The crime of libel or other similar offenses shall prescribe in 1 year. Oral defamation and slander by deed shall prescribe in 6 months. Light offenses prescribed in 2 months. So many mga light offenses, kaning mga malicious mischief, pangguba og mga property out of vengeance, out of anger, out of jealousy, kana slight physical injuries, mga light offenses nimo or kana mga ordinances na imong gi-violate. Computation of prescription of offenses. So how do you compute the prescription? The period of prescription shall commence to run from the day on which the crime is discovered by the offended party, the authorities or their agents, and shall be interrupted by the filing of the complaint or information. In short, magdagan ang prescription upon the day na na-discover ini sa offended party. So for example, let's say si Miss Maricano was, let's say si Bako Palayo raped today on May 26, and today she discovered it na gi-rape siya. So pagsugod na og dagan karon pa lang na pagka-discover niya ang prescription. So starting ang mag-count ka og 20 years starting from this day. Mo na pasabot sa computation of prescription of offenses. And mag-stop lang ang dagan sa prescription if maka-file na si Ms. Paricano og complaint or information. The term of prescription shall not run when the offender is absent from the Philippine archipelago, meaning if ang offender nimo is outside of the Philippines, then dili mag-run ang prescription. Article 92, the penalties imposed by final sentence prescribed as follows. So let's say, correctional penalty, let's say si Mr. Clamor committed the crime of acts of lasciviousness, and that is a crime which has a penalty of prison correctional. So let's say si Mr. Clamor nakaalingkawas sa prisuhan for a period of 11 years. So that means atong iyang penalty na gihatag sa iyaha, atong pag-convict sa iyaha, will also prescribe. Mawawalang visa na because this should have been served in 10 years. Pero nakalingkawas man siya for a period of 11 years. He got out of the hands of the police officers for a period of 11 years. So mauna, nag-prescribe na ang iyahang criminal liability. Again, how do you compute the prescription of penalties? The period of prescription of penalties shall commence to run from the date when the culprit should evade the service of his sentence. And it will be interrupted if the defendant should give himself up, be captured, or go to some foreign country. Klaro, or na pangutana with respect to extinguishment of criminal liability. Hello?
Question, sir.
Sige, go ahead.
Sir, sa multiple crimes gani, sir, example, multiple murder, sa pagkaunt sa penalties ana, sir, isa-isahon kada crime, sir, na nabuhat. So example, sir, if kada isa murder, reclusion temporal o reclusion perpetua 20 years. So if nagbuhat siya duha ka murder, so therefore 40 years, sir, kaya man ang duha ka penalty. Ana ba na, sir, dili?
Dili. Ang may tabo ana is when you will serve 2 or more of your of the offenses you have committed, they will be served simultaneously. And mag-start ka dito sa pinakabugat na penalty. So for example, you committed the crime of murder, theft, let's say, ana. So, mauna ang sentence nimo na murder kay para ma-cover tong theft nimo. So, it will be served simultaneously. So, let's say, reclusion temporal o let's say, prison correctional. Magsabay na silang duha na magdagan when you serve your sentence. Because under the law, it will be served simultaneously. Lain mo kayo naman, for example. Sana eh?
Okay.
40 years, plus 40 years, plus 40 years. Any question pa? Anything else? Let's continue.
Sir.
Right. If there is full extinction of criminal liability, na pwede kitawag na partial extinction of criminal liability. So unsa man ni sila mga ways for criminal liability to be extinguished partially or little by little or portion by portion. So the first one is by conditional pardon, second by commutation of the sentence, and lastly for good conduct allowances which the culprit may earn when he is serving sentence. So basic lang kayo siya. So in conditional pardon, the president will grant you pardon but with conditions. If you do not want the conditions, then you will not be pardoned. Easy as that. Should you accept the condition, you must not also commit violation of the condition set forth, or else you will be back in jail. So when you say commutation of sentence, it is the lowering of the penalty. Let's say from death to reclusion perpetua. Kaya gilower yung sentence. Good conduct allowance is being imposed by the Bureau of Prisons. If a prisoner is behaving well, they usually deduct days from his penalty. So please remember, these are your ways of extinguishing criminal liability partially by conditional pardon, by commutation of sentence, and good conduct allowances. So inform your wards na makabutan para ilang sentensya. Right, last, civil liability. Article 100 states that civil liability of a person guilty of a felony. Every person criminally liable for a felony is also civilly liable. Sir. So when a criminal case is filed against you, whether you like it or not, it is as if a civil case has also been filed against you. In effect, when a criminal case is filed, there is automatically or impliedly a civil case for recovery of civil liability filed. So when you are sentenced not only for the criminal offense, but also sentenced for your civil liability. That's why you have two aggrieved parties in a criminal action. One is the state, people of the Philippines versus blah, 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 represented by the prosecutor for the criminal offense. The other one, which is the private offended party, is given the law the right to recover civil liability. So, for example, nangawat kag cellphone, di ba? So your criminal liability there will be the act of stealing with intent to gain that cell phone. So say mo civil liability. Your civil liability would be to return that cell phone or to, kung hindi mo siya ma-return ang cell phone, kaya baligyan mo, let's say, to another individual at a higher price, ang value sa cell phone. Excuse me. About 15 minutes. And the other one is the example, katong crime of theft, di ba? So, ang civil liability mo dito is to return the cell phone to the complainant or to the victim. If you cannot return it, then because you sold it at a higher price, Then the value, you should reimburse the complainant with the value of the cell phone. And lastly, tungod kay, let's say, nangawat ka, kung sa may nahitabo sa pagpangawat, let's say, na dito ang picture sa cellphone sa iyahang mama who has already went up into heaven. So, nagka-moral damages siya kay wala tong picture sa ilahang mama o iya. So, let's say, mag-file siya moral damages kay dala dito iyang pictures. So, kada, bayranin mo ang civil liability. So, what is included in your civil liability? Restitution, reparation of the damage caused, and indemnification for consequential damages. So when you say restitution, it is the return of the thing. When you say reparation, if the thing cannot be returned, then pay the value of the thing. And if it is indemnification, it means damages. In restitution and reparation, common against crimes against property. So let's say, nangawat mo or inyong giguba fence sa inyong silingan, kay naglagot mo, kay di na mo kaagi, you can pay the value of the fence. Any indemnification for crimes against persons, common siya. Like for example, slight physical injuries, ang crime na nabuhat nimo tungod sa slight physical, tungod sa, let's say, serious physical injuries. Tungod sa serious physical injuries, kaning imuhang biktima kay wala nakatrabaho. So naay loss of income on his part. So kinahanglan mo na bayaran kay tungod tapalyado siya, di siya ka-work, he cannot feed his family. So there is loss of income. So kanang loss of income, bayaranin mo na by way of damages. So sa pa, let's say there is death of the family member due to reckless imprudence resulting to homicide, you have to pay for moral damages or actual damages. Let's say katong mga resibo na gigamit sa paglubong sa biktima. Now, extinction of civil liability should be governed by the provisions of civil law. So, ano siya ang nag-govern sa civil law? So, saan mo pagbayad sa imong civil liability? So, kaning asterisk lang akong i-emphasize because kaning man ang pinaka-common. Let's say, may payment or performance. Let's say, it's either iuli nimo ang cellphone, so that is performance, or ibayad nimo ang value sa cellphone na imong gikawat, so that is payment or performance. Let's say, buutan imuhang biktima or complainant, sige lang, ay na to bayre, pasaylo na tika. So there is condonation or remission of the debt. And lastly, if there is compensation, let's say, estafa imong i-commit. Ang rason ganong defraud nimo imong amigo kay gusto nimo kuhaon to utang niya. And let's say, ang utang niya is 10,000. And napod siya utang sa imuha na 10,000. So ano ta, mag-quits na lang tao, kay total naman kay utang sa 10,000, utang sa muna 10,000, i-quits na lang na to. So that is compensation or offsetting of the obligation. And so that is your book law, criminal law book 1. Those are the most salient provisions under criminal law book 1. Any questions so far as to the provisions? Is there anything that you would like to clarify, to be clarified upon?
Sir, excuse sir.
Uh-uh.
Kuan gana sir, kanang kinta nay tao nga kanang nay tao ay kibali ang tag-iya sa kanang kibali ang tag-iya gikawatan siya kupras. Tapos kita. Tapos ang nakakita kay gibaligya sa iya tapos na-trace sa kanang pulis ang katong awat nakita ay na-trace sa pulis nga gibaligya atong nakakita og kopras ang katong kopras tapos gikuan ang tao sir gusto sa tao ibalik ang halin. Then ningon ang kanang tag-iya nga dili niya dawaton kay dili man siya Nya pagkakuan sir gipa so muna na pud niya sir kay gusto niya pa kuan ang kanang kwarta ipabalik na pud niya. Pwede ba na siya sir nya kabal which is isa ka pulis na ngayo pud og bahin atong kuan bahin sa halin sa upras.
Actually, putol-putol gud ka. Pwede nimo i-type sa group chat kay para matubag nako.
Ano sir? Ay na sir, sulti lang nako sir. Okay na sir, klaro na?
Putol-putol gyapon.
Ang iya pasabot kay